As organizational leaders, working professionals, and members of a multicultural, multi-generational world, there is a lot of talk regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the why behind it. But what do these terms even mean? What are the foundational elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Navigating it, understanding it, leading it in your workplace, in your community. Well, to understand, embrace, and activate the what, the why, the how of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to me, it's essential to understand our own salient identities and to embrace and celebrate taking an identity-centered approach to our work. Further, we must approach DEI through a lens of what we call intersectionality. As the second of the 6 building blocks of DEI, identity consciousness and intersectionality opens us up to new ways of understanding the world around us. By the way, I'm Raven Solomon, founder and CEO of Raven Solomon Enterprises, your trusted diversity, equity, and inclusion education and consulting firm. As you embark on your journey of inclusive leadership or becoming an inclusive individual, I invite and challenge you to approach the work of DEI through this framework. Here at RSC, we call the 6 building blocks of DEI. Let's get started. The second building block of DEI is really about embracing identities and intersectionality. There are numerous dimensions of diversity or dimensions of identity to consider when you're talking about this concept of diversity, encompassing, let's say, gender identity, race, ethnicity, physical ability, educational attainment, socioeconomic status, and the list goes on and on. It is crucial to recognize that our individual identities, who we are not confined to just one of these single dimensions, one of these single attributes. Instead, who we are, how we identify is shaped by the intricate interplay and overlap of these attributes that collectively shape our experiences within the world and how the world experiences us. This concept is known as intersectionality. For example, when you complete, let's say, an annual tax form, we all love those, right? And other standard paperwork, we oftentimes are asked to check boxes denoting things like our marital status. The options might include single, married, widowed, head of household, etc. Each of these terms are what we call identifiers, or sometimes we call them an identity. And they describe the relationship that best reflects our status with that particular classification or grouping. As Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal activist and scholar, once said, identities are not just a relationship to self, but a relationship to history and to the world around us. What's important to understand is that the culmination of our identities impacts how we experience the world and how we engage in our workplaces and communities. It also impacts how others engage with us. We experience the world in many ways based on our racial identity, perhaps, or our ethnicity, our gender identity, our sexuality, ability, socioeconomic status, and of course, many other identifiers. Our identities inform both how we experience the world and how the world experiences us. Whether we pay attention to our identities or not, the world around us and the systems at play do. They are in many ways hyper-aware of our identities. Oppression and inequities have been created throughout history in an identity-centered way. Given that discrimination and bias are informed by identities, shouldn't our approach to dismantling these systems also center identity, but in a celebratory way? Taking an identity-conscious or identity-centered approach to allyship, inclusion, and leadership can inform how we respond to and embrace difference. Identity consciousness is about the sensitivity and acknowledgement of difference and bias, the cognizance of how we engage in systems that are counterintuitive to our comfort, and our understanding of how this comfort or the lack thereof shapes and frames cultures and spaces. In discussing identities, it's critical to note that certain identities hold power and privilege. Privilege is the inherent set of benefits that one possesses by virtue of belonging to certain socially centered groups. Said differently, privilege is when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Privilege can appear both in interpersonal interactions and in organizational and systemic ways. Majority groups often experience privilege or the general benefit of the doubt. This can come in the form of racial privilege, economic privilege, and other forms of systemic behavior and outcome advantages. Similarly, privileged identities can be the ones we least consider. For instance, if you watch this video in a home where you pay the utility bills, that is privilege. Living without chronic illness or pain, or being a member of a majority religious group are also forms of privileged identities. Privilege and oppression are two key areas through which we understand intersectionality, as theorized by scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. Crenshaw states, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. Intersectionality is about the convergence of dimensions of diversity that really create unique realities for subsets of people within a shared group. This convergence, again, impacts our unique experiences within systems, and our various identities impact the nuances of our own personal intersections. Understanding intersectionality impacts our relationships with things like oppression, power, marginalization, privilege very differently. When we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion through an identity-centered and intersectional lens, we can begin to celebrate differences and bridge gaps while dismantling inequities. Our communities and organizations are stronger when we celebrate differences and ensure that differences are both leveraged and accounted for. Our identities inform not only the equity and justice we seek, but also how we might show up and advocate for others. When we understand and embrace identities through an intersectional lens, we create opportunities to further call attention to and eliminate oppressive and hierarchical systems of both power and privilege. The important attention that needs to be paid to identity and intersectionality is precisely why these themes make up this second building block of DEI. Understanding the 6 building blocks of DEI allows us to reimagine the roles we can all play in achieving equity and fostering inclusion. Both individual behavior and systemic change will create the world in which we hope to both live in and leave for future generations. I hope you will join me in continuing to learn about these 6 building blocks of diversity, equity, and inclusion as we uncover the what, the why, the how of this work, i.e., discovering, embracing, and activating DEI.